Hello and welcome to the Digestive System lecture. So for this lecture we want to talk about the digestive system. We want to talk about all the parts of the digestive system and what they do. So we're going to talk about the anatomy and physiology of this pretty complex system. This is a really important system because digestion is the mechanical and chemical breakdown of food and the absorption of the food into the body. So that's a pretty big responsibility that this particular system has. And all of the systems rely on the digestive system to provide nutrients and vitamins and minerals for the human body. It also absorbs water as well. So the digestive system, if you look at the anatomy of it, is made of basically a tube that starts from your mouth and goes all the way to the anus. And that tube is called the alimentary canal. And it's like I said, it starts at the mouth. It includes the pharynx, which is the back of your throat. It includes the esophagus, the stomach, all the portions of the small intestine. We'll talk about there's three portions of the small intestine, all the portions of the large intestine, and eventually the rectum and then anal canal. Now, all along the way of this tube, there's going to be glands that are going to be and organs that are going to be accessory to the jobs of the parts of the alimentary canal. So we're going to have salivary glands. They're going to add saliva. We're going to have the liver, which is going to do things like add bile to the digestive materials. We're going to have the gallbladder, which stores the bile and injects it into the small intestine. And then we're going to have the pancreas as well. And these are what the organs look like. So starting at the very front, or at the very beginning, we have the mouth and the oral cavity. Sliding back down, we're going to have the pharynx, which is the back of the throat. Food is then going to move into the esophagus, and then it's going to drop into the stomach. Okay. Once it's in the stomach, it's going to move into the small intestine. The first portion of the small intestine is called the duodenum or the duodenum, and then it's going to move into the jejunum and then the ileum. Eventually, it's going to come out into the large intestine. The little first portion of the large intestine is called the cecum. Hanging off the cecum is the appendix. Then we're going to come up the ascending colon. We're going to go across the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon. We'll end up in the rectum and be stored as waste products, and then we'll go out of the anal canal and be deposited outside the body. So this lecture is going to talk about each of these parts, including the salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, all the accessory organs. So for my class, you're going to be expected to be able to draw a diagram of this, label all the parts. So you'll need to know all the parts, all the jobs of the parts. It's a pretty intensive amount of material to go over. So in a freshly dissected body, this is what these parts look like, and so you get a sense of that. So here's your stomach over here, and here's the liver, gallbladder, and in this particular diagram, you can't see the pancreas. It's tucked in underneath, but you can see the portions of the small intestine. Here's the jejunum, here's the ileum, and then you can see portions of the large intestine. Here's the cecum, the ascending colon, and then we can see the transverse colon, descending colon. So this is essentially what things look like, but there have been things that are taken away in regards to the coverings around these organs. So let's talk about those coverings that were taken away in that previous diagram. And these coverings are called the peritoneum, and it's divided into various portions. So the parietal peritoneum is the wall of the abdominal cavity. I'm not sure you can see it in this picture right here, but this wall, let's see if I can change my color here. So this wall over here is going to be made of the parietal peritoneum. And this is just a membrane making up the cavity called the peritoneal cavity. The visceral peritoneum is covering some of the digestive organs. It's also known as the serosa, and we'll see what that looks like as we start looking at some pictures of this. There is a space or a cavity between the parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum, and that's called the peritoneal cavity. And this cavity is full of serous fluid, which is a lubricating fluid, so the organs can slide, slide past the abdominal wall without causing friction. And so that lubricating fluid is pretty important for that reason. Now this peritoneum is going to contain folds that weave between organs and bind them together. And they contain lots of blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels. All of these things will aid the digestive organs in doing the job that they need to perform. So let's look at these folds. So the first fold we're going to see is called the greater omentum, and it's the largest fold. It covers the transverse colon, the small intestine, and is responsible, if you see it in people that have lots of adipose tissue in it, it's responsible for what we call the beer belly. So if you look at people, at the beach and you see a big beer belly, that particular physical characteristics created by adipose tissue that's being collected in the greater omentum. Another fold that you see is called the falciform ligament. This attaches the liver to the anterior abdominal wall and to the diaphragm so that the liver is not sloshing around. Another fold is the lesser omentum, and it connects the stomach and the duodenum of the small intestine to the liver. And then lastly, we have the mesentery. Mesentery binds the jejunum and the ileum of the small intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. Again, so they're not sloshing around as well. And this particular fold can store large amounts of adipose tissue as well. And so let's go through and we'll look at each one of these structures. So here's the falciform ligament, and it's found, connecting the two lobes of your liver together, and then attaching it to the abdominal wall so that the liver doesn't slosh around. So the brown structure here is your liver, and here we can see the stomach and the transverse colon. Here's your greater omentum. That's kind of like an apron around your attached to your large intestine and covering your small intestine. So this is what the greater omentum looks like in a cadaver. So it is yellowish, full of adipose tissue. Here's your falciform ligament, so you can see what that kind of looks like in a real human. And there's your diaphragm that separates the abdominal from the thoracic cavity. And there's that falciform ligament right there, and it connects in to the abdominal wall diaphragm. All right, so here would be your lesser omentum, and you can see it's connecting in to your stomach, connecting it to your liver, so it doesn't slosh around. Here's the greater omentum lifted upwards so that you can see the mesentery. Mesentery will connect in all your small intestines, so again they're connected together and they're not sloshing around. But within that mesentery you also have blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, so it's really an important part of the digestive system. Okay, so there are major activities that the digestive system does for us, and I thought I'd just list them here for you. One of the jobs of the digestive system is ingestion. Ingestion is the taking in of food into the digestive tract. So we have certain parts that are basically that are made for doing ingestion. We then have propulsion. This is the movement of food through the alimentary canal. So this includes a swallowing reflex, and then peristalsis, which is the rhythmical contraction of the muscle tissue of the digestive tract, pushing food in the right way to go down to be digested. So another essential activity of the digestive system is mechanical breakdown. So as you eat food, you mechanically break it down into smaller and smaller chunks. Every time you do that, it increases the surface area around the food chunks so that the ingested food can be digested more efficiently. So mechanical breakdown includes chewing, done typically in your mouth and by your teeth, churning, which is kind of done by the muscle tissue of the stomach, and then segmentation which is breaking the chewed food particles into smaller and smaller parts. And this is done by all of the digestive system, all the way from the esophagus to the small intestine. So digestion is the chemical breakdown of food using enzymes. So these enzymes will break food down into their smallest chemical components, which can be absorbed by the wall of the small intestine, and perhaps even some in the stomach and some in the large intestine. So absorption is the movement of digested food through the mucosal cells into the blood and lymphatic system. Okay, so food is not in our body until it's absorbed and moves across the wall of the intestines, and then into the bloodstream. And then finally we have defecation, and this is the elimination of indigestible substances. Okay, so we have food coming in, it's being propelled through the body, mechanically broken down, chemically broken down, absorbed, and then whatever can't be absorbed is going to move on out through defecation. Okay, so the alimentary canal, you can think of it as being like a garden hose. It starts at your mouth and comes out at your anus, but it's one continuous tube, and it's a muscular tube. Now that tube does change in its characteristics from the mouth all the way to the anus. Different parts of the alimentary canal have to do different jobs. Some of them have to produce digestive enzymes. Some of them have to absorb food. Some of them have to absorb water. Some of the digestive tube has to just push food through. Even some of it makes acid. So it is a muscular tube, but it does change in its composition as you go from the mouth to the anus. Now this muscular tube is going to mix food and contract and propel food. Those propelling movements, as I stated before, are called peristalsis. The structure of the tube is similar along its length in terms of when you cut it in cross-section and look at the layering of it. It does have a mucosa, submucosa, a muscle layer, and a serosa, but there are slight variations according to each job that each portion performs. The 4 layers will include the mucosa, submucosa, the muscle layer, and the serosa. So the mucosal layer is the innermost layer. So it's the layer that would come in contact with the food. It's the layer that's in contact with the lumen, or the hollow space inside of the tube. And it's a moist epithelial membrane, so it's a mucosal membrane. And it lines the entire digestive tract. And it has a lot of jobs that it performs. So it secretes substances, like it might secrete digestive juices, or it might secrete things like mucus. It helps to absorb digestive materials, and of course it protects all along the way from the food particles and from bacteria. The submucosa is a dense connective tissue, and it contains blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerve fibers. So the muscularis externa, or the muscle layer, is a smooth muscle layer, and its job is to create waves of rhythmic contraction called peristalsis. And then lastly, we have the serosa, which is a protective outer layer for the organ. It's also known as the visceral peritoneum, which we talked about a little bit earlier. So this is that 4-layer construction that we just talked about, and it's cut in cross-section. You can see it's a relatively sophisticated arrangement. So let's just go through and we'll talk about a few of the things, how they're arranged. So we have the lumen, which is this inner space here. That's where the food would be traveling through. Touching that lumen is the mucosa, and that's made of your epithelium. So it could be different kinds of epithelial tissue, stratified squamous or a simple columnar. It just depends on where it is as to what kind of epithelium it is. Underneath that epithelium is a lamina propria. It's a connective tissue layer that supports the epithelial tissue layer. We then have a little muscular layer that is surrounding that. We then move into the submucosa. That's going to be your connective tissue layer, and that will have your blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and such. We then have the muscularis externa, which is going to be a muscle layer. This will be the smooth muscle layer. If you've ever eaten chitlins before, the reason you eat chitlins and it's nourishing is because it has a pretty thick muscularis externa, and what you're eating when you eat chitlins is a lot of it's smooth muscle tissue. Just make sure you clean it before you eat it, because there is poop that's basically in the lumen. So the muscularis externa does have muscle tissue that runs in different ways. So there is a layer of circular muscles, and then there's a layer of longitudinal muscles. So the circular muscles go in this way. They encircle, and when they contract, they basically close the lumen or narrow the lumen. The longitudinal muscles run this way, so they run the long axis of the organ, and when they squeeze, it basically flattens out. It flattens out the whole organ. And so if you've ever squeezed toothpaste before, squeezing toothpaste is kind of like, if you squeeze a large amount of the toothpaste tube, that's like contracting the longitudinal muscles. If you just squeezed in a circular fashion around the toothpaste tube, that would just be squeezing the circular muscles. And then finally, we have an outer layer. It's usually made of like a simple squamous epithelium, and that's the serosal layer. So lots and lots and lots of blood vessels and nerves, and you can see the mesentery coming off there, supplying all those blood vessels and nerves and lymphatic vessels to the tissue there. Now the alimentary canal all along its length is controlled in many different kinds of ways. So there are all kinds of, so this is the lumen of the tube, but there's all kinds of local factors that give signals, to various kinds of receptors that the nervous system has planted into this tissue. Local factors would include things like just a physical distortion of the wall of the alimentary canal because of food being forced through it. You can also have chemicals like fats or other kinds of chemicals. You can have acids. All of these things will be triggers to trigger the central nervous system to deal with what's going on inside of this canal. So you can see there's chemoreceptors and stress receptors in the walls of this alimentary canal, and these reflexes are going to trigger the central nervous system, either the spinal cord or literally the brain, to cause peristalsis or segmentation. We'll look at segmentation in a little bit. So it causes movements of those muscles. Also, it can cause secretion of various kinds of buffers, acids, or enzymes to be released into the lumen of the canal. We also have hormones that will also be involved in this alimentary canal. So there are sensors that can sense changes in chemical composition. Hormones can be released into the bloodstream by the wall of the alimentary canal, and then you will have secretion of various products that will be dumped into the lumen of the alimentary canal. Now, these receptors and these effects and these hormones are going to be different all along the different parts of the alimentary canal. And I just thought I'd go ahead and share with you just kind of what peristalsis kind of looks like, since we were talking about the alimentary canal. But if you have food coming in, so we have a contraction of the circular muscles, will block the food from going back this way. We then have contraction of the longitudinal muscles, which will force the food in this kind of way. So we basically cut it off, and then we push the longitudinal muscles, and it forces food in a direction towards the next organ of the alimentary canal. So it's rhythmic waves of contraction. You can't have it not rhythmically because then it won't move in the direction that it needs to go. Okay, so I want to take and start at the mouth and go all the way toward the anus and talk about each of the parts that food comes in contact with. So the mouth is the first site of both chemical and mechanical digestion of food. So we do have cheeks and lips. So as you chew, the cheeks and lips will hold food into your mouth cavity or your oral cavity. They do serve as points of, of contact or friction against food, so it helps to break it down mechanically. Lips also serves the function of sensing the thermal properties of food. If the food is too hot, your lips will tell you immediately. Very sensitive area of the body. So the tongue is involved in both the mechanical and chemical breakdown of food. The tongue produces an enzyme called lingual lipase, and a lipase is an enzyme that helps to break down fats into fatty acids and glycerol. The tongue also is an organ that mechanically can push food against the various hard palate or soft palate or the cheeks and help to mechanically break food down. Your palate is made up of your maxillary and your palatine bones. We also have a soft palate beyond that, made of just a connective tissue. And this palate is hard, and it is used by your tongue to push and flatten food out as you're chewing. So we do have tonsils, which are really not part of the digestive system, but they're part of the immune system. And we have talked about the tonsils helping to educate your body about local germs so that it can help to protect you from those local organisms. Of course, teeth are going to be involved in major mechanical digestion of food. We have 4 different kinds of teeth. We have incisors, canines, bicuspids, and cuspids. Each have a different shape to help digest food in a different kind of way, or to process food in a different kind of way. Aiding in the chemical digestion of food, and really part of mechanical as well, are the salivary glands. These produce and secrete salivary amylase, which aids in the breakdown of starch and glycogen into glucose molecules. Salivary glands also, have water in them and mucus to help lubricate and help food to be, mechanically and chemically broken down. So I thought I'd just share with you what your tongue looks like. So your tongue, if you were to take and pull it out and look at it, it has all kinds of little bumps on the surface of it. Those little bumps are going to be papillae, and these papillae are going to serve various functions such as aiding in friction and or grip on your food, and serving as sensory receptors or taste buds. So the filiform papilla singular, papillae is plural. Filiform papilla are white, and they give the tongue a roughness and provide friction, and these do not contain sensory receptors. If you've ever felt a cat's tongue has really super papillae that allow them to serve almost like combs to clean their fur and to get themselves cleaned. So fungiform papillae are going to be reddish. They're scattered all over the tongue, and these do contain taste receptors. So making a V is your valate papilla. It makes a little row, almost like a V shape toward the back of the tongue, and they contain taste buds. And then your foliate papillae are on the back of your tongue. And they're on the side of your tongue, and these particular, they're right here. These are going to be on the lateral aspects and posterior of the tongue, and they do contain taste buds as well. Here you can see some of the lingual tonsils and the palatine tonsils. Those are going to help educate your body to the local germs. Okay, and just kind of covering some of the parts we just talked about. So your lips, they hold the food in. They are sensory receptors as well for the thermal properties of the food that we're eating. We do have the hard palate, made up of the maxillary and the palatine bones. We have the soft palate back there. Those are parts that the food can be pushed against to mechanically break food down. Of course, we have teeth, and we'll talk about the different kinds of teeth. You have incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. And those do different jobs of mechanically breaking food down. So we can see kind of the vestibule and the frenulum. These are just parts in between the teeth and the tongue, and it's a place where saliva and things can collect and be secreted into the oral cavity. Of course, your tongue is a muscle and a sensory organ. It also produces lingual lipase to help digest fats. And we talked about the tonsils being parts that help you educate your body about germs. The uvula is going to be at the very back of the soft palate, and when you swallow, this will actually close off the nasopharynx so that you don't breathe your food up into your nasal cavity. Okay, so salivary glands are going to produce saliva. They lie outside of the oral cavity but have tubes that connect to the oral cavity so they can dump their products. And we have the parotid, the submandibular, and the sublingual tonsils. These are going to be your major salivary glands. And then you have minor salivary glands that augment the job of the major salivary glands. And they're just located scattered throughout the oral cavity. This is just a picture showing you some of these glands. So the large parotid gland is located on the kind of the side of your jaw and side of your face. And you can see it has, if I get my pen color right, you can see that it has a duct that leads to your oral cavity. We then have the sublinguals and the submandibular. So here's your sublinguals here below the tongue, and that's underneath of the mucosa of that. So it's not, so it's underneath the tongue, but it's underneath the skin. So it's underneath this little skin layer. Let's change the color of my pen so you can see that. It's underneath this little skin layer, this little mucosal layer here. And there are ducts that lead up from it into the oral cavity. And then we have the submandibular that's located right here. Of course, it has a duct that goes through and dumps it into the oral cavity. So the functions of saliva, are numerous. Of course, it cleanses the mouth. It dissolves food chemicals for taste. So your taste receptors have to have the taste molecules dissolved in the watery fluid so that it can sense it. It moistens food to make it easier to slide down, compacts the food into a bolus, which is a nice little almost like oval shaped structure that helps you to slide the food down to your esophagus. And then it includes chemicals like the salivary amylase, which breaks down starch and glycogen with those enzymes. So about 99% to 97% of saliva is water. It's going to have buffers in it that help it to keep the pH around 7 inside your mouth. There are many kinds of electrolytes that are found in saliva. We have sodium, potassium, chloride, phosphate, and bicarbonate. That's a buffering material. So salivary amylase, lingual lipase will be in saliva. Mucin, which is a mucopolysaccharide. It's a slippery mucopolysaccharide protein, slippery protein that helps to lubricate food and helps it slide down. There are some wastes inside of saliva, urea and uric acid. It also contains some interesting things like lysozyme, which helps to digest bacteria. There are antibodies inside of saliva, which help us to defend ourselves against viruses and bacteria. And then there are defensins, which are antimicrobial proteins, which protect us from microorganisms. We produce about 1,500 milliliters per day. So that's 1.5 liters. So if you saw a 2-liter bottle, think of 1.5 liters, almost a 2-liter bottle of saliva each day is made. And if you chew gum, it's probably a lot more because gum chewing will stimulate salivation. So the major salivary glands are activated by the nervous system. We have the parasympathetic nervous system is going to stimulate it to increase salivation. So the thing that activates the parasympathetic nervous system is the ingested food. We do have chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors that can sense the chemicals and also just the stretch of food in your mouth. And this is going to, and smell too will activate, the salivation as well. So these chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors will activate nuclei in the brain. So the salivatory nuclei in the brainstem will send impulses along cranial nerve number 7 and number 9, and these are going to activate parasympathetic activity, which is secretion of saliva. So strong sympathetic stimulation will inhibit salivation and cause you to have a dry mouth. So if you've ever stood in front of people to give an oral presentation and your mouth gets dry, it's because your sympathetic nervous system is activating and salivation is diminishing. Xerostomia is the name we use for dry mouth. All right, so teeth are basically there to tear and to grind food for digestion. We are born with 20 deciduous teeth. So these are what we would consider our baby teeth. These teeth will erupt through the gum at about 6 to 24 months of age. And so eventually they will be pushed out around 6 to 12 years of age as your permanent teeth develop and push them out. So these permanent teeth will push the teeth, the baby teeth out. The roots of the baby teeth will be resorbed back into the body, and then the tooth will fall out. So we have around 32 permanent teeth. Most of you don't have 32 permanent teeth because you had your wisdom teeth taken out, or will have your wisdom teeth taken out. So all but the third molars are in by the end of adolescence, and then the third molars will come in around 17 to 25 years of age. Or they may not erupt at all. They may stay inside of your jaw forever. Or they may not develop at all. I love this picture because it shows basically a real person's tooth or jaws. The maxilla and the mandible have been eroded away, so you can see how the teeth are anchored in. I like to show you this because I like to show you that permanent teeth are actually inside of the maxilla or the mandible, and they will eventually erupt and push upwards and push those baby teeth out. So you can see this one's being pushed out. That baby tooth's almost about to fall out. Here's the wisdom teeth back here, the third molar back here, and that hasn't erupted through the tooth yet. I mean, through the gum yet. So this is showing you what we call the milk teeth or deciduous teeth. We call it deciduous teeth because they shed or fall out. And these are the numbers that you have. So you have first and second molars, you have canines, you have lateral and central incisors. So 20 of those teeth, those will all fall out. Once you get your permanent teeth, then you'll have 3 molars on each side. You'll have 2 premolars, and then you'll have a pair of canines, and then you'll have 4 incisors altogether. Okay, so we have 6 molars, 4 premolars, 2 canines, and 4 incisors for the top, and then the same for the bottom. So incisors are like choppers. They're chisel shaped, and they're used for cutting. Canines are going to be fang-like, and they're used to basically tear or pierce food that we're eating. Think of carnivorous animals have really long canines to help them tear and rip food from the flesh of its prey. Premolars are going to be kind of broad, rounded. They're used to crush and grind food, and then molars are going to be kind of flattened out, and they're best for grinding food. I love this picture. It shows how the tooth is anchored into the bones of the maxilla and mandible. So you can see that there are certain parts of the tooth. We have the crown, the neck, and the root. So each part has its own little job that it performs. The crown is the exposed part, and it's covered by a very, very, very tough material called enamel. Enamel is made of calcium salts and hydroxyapatite crystals, so it's a bone material, and it's the hardest substance that the body produces. As the tooth erupts through, the enamel-producing cells will eventually degenerate, and enamel will no longer be made. There is no healing if decay or a crack forms inside of the enamel. Now, we do have polymers and dental practices where we can go in and correct those things. We can drill out the enamel and put in a metallic substance in place of it, but naturally it doesn't heal itself. So the neck is going to be connects the crown to the root, and then the root is the portion that's embedded in the jawbone. Okay, so we do basically anchor the root by periodontal ligaments. These are really tough ligaments, and it's a fibrous joint that's formed, and it's immovable. So there is a cement-like material that helps to anchor that as well. Okay, so we're talking pretty tough stuff. The gingiva or gum helps to basically cover over the bone and covers over the softer bone material called dentin from the enamel. So you can see the gingiva covers over the enamel so that bacteria can't work its way down in. Now, if you have receding gums, where your gums are receding, then that dentin will be exposed and bacteria can slide in and begin to digest the bony material. So dentin is a bone-like material. It's under the enamel, but it's softer, and it is easily attacked by bacteria. That's a lot of times where we get our cavities, right in these areas. So it's really important to floss your teeth to ensure that you have nice healthy gums and you can get the stuff in between out, the plaque and bacteria, and get those gums nice and clean. You definitely don't want gum recession. The pulp cavity is located right here, and it's surrounded by the dentin, and it's made of connective tissue, blood vessels, and nerves. So your tooth will be able to feel or sense pain or when a cavity or infection has developed inside of it. So the root canal, if we move on down, this is the root canal down here. That's just a passageway for blood vessels and nerves to enter into the pulp cavity. There is an apical foramen at the very bottom, and that is at the very, very end or root, at the very base of the root, and this is the entry point for blood vessels and nerves, and lymphatic vessels for that matter. All right, so moving on through a little bit more, we get to the pharynx, which is kind of like the back of your throat, and this is located between the oral cavity and the esophagus. It's also located between the oral cavity and the windpipe, and there is a fold of tissue called the epiglottis that can cover over the windpipe whenever you swallow. The windpipe is anterior; it's in the front side. The esophagus is posterior, right behind the windpipe. So every time you swallow, if you don't close over the windpipe, food will go into it, and that causes real problems. So moving down beyond the esophagus, the pharynx is the esophagus. This is a passageway for food from the pharynx to the stomach. And again, that peristalsis will be rhythmic waves of muscular contraction that will carry the food to the stomach from the esophagus. You can have reverse peristalsis, and that causes vomiting to occur. So that happens sometimes when we have an upset stomach. So this is just the esophagus, showing you kind of the histology of the esophagus. That mucosa is a nice thick chunky layer. It's made of a stratified squamous epithelium to protect your esophagus from from food that might be still tough and sharp. We have the submucosa, the muscle layer, and then we have the serosal layer on the outside surface. So it is a stratified squamous epithelium. It's a non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, so we don't have that dead layer up here, but we just have living cells from the base to the top. These cells will shed off, so we continuously repair and heal and replace cells that are being shed off all the time. Just to reiterate, you do have different muscles. We have circular and longitudinal muscles that aid in propelling the food down into the stomach. So swallowing does occur in stages. Kind of the first stage in swallowing is called the buccal phase, and this is where we form a bolus and we push it to the back of the throat. When we push it to the back of the throat, we do have the uvula and parts of the soft palate that will fold upwards and close off the nasopharynx so that food doesn't go up into the nasal cavity. Okay, once the bolus enters into the oropharynx, we're going to basically have a reflex that's going to draw it into the esophagus. So during the pharyngeal phase, or the pharyngeal phase, that uvula stays closed off. We have the epiglottis is going to close over the windpipe so that food doesn't go through the windpipe. That bolus will slide on down into the esophagus, and then you're going to have rhythmic waves of contraction that will carry that on through to the stomach. That occurs during the esophageal phase. So peristalsis is just going to take it on down into the stomach. Now there are mucus glands all along the esophagus mucosal wall that lubricate so that the food can slide on down. Let me just back up here 1 second and talk about this part right here. Let me take all the ink off. There is an upper esophageal sphincter right there, and that has to relax in order for food to come in. So I just wanted to basically go back and tell you that there isn't a sphincter up there that has to be relaxed in order for food to come in. That sphincter will close off so that food doesn't go back up unless you're vomiting. So as food approaches the stomach, the lower esophageal sphincter right here will relax, and it will open up and allow food to slide on in. Once the food is in, this upper esophageal sphincter will contract so that stomach acid won't make its way back up into the esophagus, because that's not where you want stomach acid to be, is in your esophagus. All right, so moving into the stomach, the jobs of the stomach are to mix food with gastric juices. It's going to initiate protein digestion. It's going to absorb small amounts of nutrients, and it's going to move food into the small intestine. And there are regions of the stomach. So let me go back, excuse me. So we have the cardiac region of the stomach, we have the fundic region of the stomach, we have the body region of the stomach, which is made up of little folds of that mucosa and muscle tissue, and those are called rugae. We then have the pyloric region of the stomach, which gets close to the pyloric canal, which will enter into the first portion of the small intestine called the duodenum. Now, some books have duodenum or duodenum. I don't mind if you pronounce it either way. There is a sphincter there called the pyloric sphincter that shuts off anything going into the small intestine, or allows it to go into the small intestine if it's ready to enter in. So the inner lining of the stomach is a mucous membrane. It has many gastric pits, which are openings to gastric glands. And if I just go forward and show you what that looks like. So here's the gastric pit, and you can see the lining of the stomach right there. It's a simple columnar epithelium, and it goes into where there are gastric glands. So we'll come back and look at that in 1 second. There are 4 cell types that compose the gastric glands. We have the mucous cells. These are going to be also called mucous neck cells, and these produce and secrete mucus. This helps to protect the inner lining of the stomach from being digested from hydrochloric acid. It also lubricates things and keeps things moving through. We also have in those gastric glands chief cells. These are going to secrete the digestive enzyme called pepsinogen. Now, this is an enzyme that's secreted in an inactive form. It's only activated once it reaches the actual stomach, the body of the stomach, where there's hydrochloric acid. Once it has hydrochloric acid, it's then cleaved and made into an active protein, and it digests proteins. So these chief cells also secrete gastric lipase to help digest lipids. So the parietal cells are going to also be in those gastric glands. They're going to secrete a couple of products. One of them is hydrochloric acid, and another is called intrinsic factor. Hydrochloric acid is going to activate pepsinogen into pepsin. It's also going to help to process digested food. Probably a third reason that it's important is to help to neutralize viruses and bacteria. So another thing made by parietal cells is intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor helps the small intestine to absorb vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is critical for your production of red blood cells. G cells are also going to be found in those gastric glands, and they secrete a hormone called gastrin. This particular hormone is going to stimulate the stomach to secrete hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. So it is a hormone secreted into the bloodstream that goes back to the wall of the stomach and tells the wall of the stomach to secrete hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. Just looking at some of the histology of this, you can see the gastric pit and the gastric gland. When we can see that there are mucous cells. On the surface, there are then mucous neck cells inside of the gastric glands. We have parietal cells, which make and secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. We have chief cells, which secrete pepsinogen and gastric lipase. Then we have the G cells that secrete the hormone gastrin into the bloodstream. Just to reiterate the fact that pepsinogen is made in an inactive form, you don't want it to be activated in these gastric glands because if pepsin can digest, the activated form of pepsinogen can digest your stomach. So you only want it where food is going to be. Hydrochloric acid is the thing that will digest pepsinogen into pepsin. Pepsin, once it's activated, can also auto-cleave. It can go back and cleave pepsinogen into activated pepsin. So we do have a tight regulation of gastric secretion. We do create about 3 liters of gastric juice per day from the gastric mucosa. The vagus nerve, under the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system, will increase the secretion of gastric juice. The sympathetic stimulation will decrease the secretion of gastric juice. Also, gastric juice will be secreted under hormonal stimulation, so mainly the hormone gastrin, but also histamine and acetylcholine can be activators of gastric secretion. So those particular 3 hormones will increase enzyme and hydrochloric secretion. So this is the parietal cell, and on the parietal cell there are receptors for the hormone gastrin, acetylcholine, and histamine. And if it basically these things touch those receptors, you'll get hydrochloric acid production. This will be dumped into the lumen, or the space where food would be in the stomach. So it's kind of interesting. How does the stomach make hydrochloric acid? I mean, how does it make acid? It's kind of interesting. So it's going to use the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffering system. So there is an enzyme called carbonic acid that will mediate this. So inside the parietal cell, water and carbon dioxide will form carbonic acid. Carbonic anhydrase will dissociate carbonic acid into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. Now those hydrogen ions will be pumped out into the space of the stomach, and that's going to combine with chloride ions to form hydrochloric acid. But the bicarbonate that's made at the end of at the side of the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffering system, that bicarbonate will use an antiporter. This is a protein in the membrane of the parietal cell, and it'll export carbonic acid and import chloride ions. It'll then use a chloride ion channel to export chloride ions into the lumen of the stomach. So hydrogen ions and chloride ions will come together to form hydrochloric acid. So it's kind of cool using that carbonic acid bicarbonate buffering system to create hydrochloric acid. I think I'll stop at this point, and we'll pick up with the pancreas in our next lecture. So until then, I will see you later.